What if one of the greatest minds in philosophy whispered a truth so disturbing that the world pretended it never heard it? Arthur Schopenhauer wasn't just another thinker lost to the shadows of time. He was a man who saw through illusions. A pessimist? Maybe. But more precisely, he was a surgeon of human nature dissecting it without anesthesia, and what he found was not beautiful. In the mid-19th century, Schopenhauer wrote an essay so incendiary, so radically out of alignment with the polite ideals of his day, that it was largely dismissed, buried, and condemned. The essay was called On Women. Not a philosophical musing, not a polite critique, but a raw, uncompromising autopsy of the feminine as he saw it. It was not well received. But here's the twist. His essay wasn't merely hateful. It wasn't just personal bitterness disguised as theory. It was something far more dangerous, philosophically consistent, a logical extension of the very worldview that made Schopenhauer famous. His ideas on metaphysics, will, suffering, and illusion all converged in this one forbidden text, yet when he spoke, few listened. Or rather, they pretended not to hear. Was it because he was wrong? Or because he said something society couldn't afford to acknowledge? This video is not about defending Schopenhauer. It's not about celebrating his views or dragging women into a philosophical courtroom. It's about something deeper, more unnerving. It's about a world that punishes truth when it becomes too sharp. We live in an age obsessed with visibility, where every whisper becomes a tweet, every secret a trend, and yet, the real taboos remain untouched. Schopenhauer's confession remains one of them. He wasn't canceled. He was ignored. This wasn't a philosopher raging against love. This was a man revealing how nature plays a trick on us, using beauty, emotion, and desire as weapons. He believed women were the foot soldiers of nature's scheme, not villains, not evil, just perfectly adapted instruments of manipulation, crafted not by morality but by biology. It's a claim that still makes people flinch. So before you react, pause. This story isn't about hatred. It's about perception, about illusion, about the terrifying possibility that what we want to believe might be exactly what prevents us from seeing the world as it really is. In this documentary, we'll unearth Schopenhauer's buried essay, decode its core ideas, and examine them through the lens of modern psychology, philosophy, and evolutionary science. We'll also ask, why was he so swiftly silenced? And what happens to a society that punishes those who speak forbidden truths? You might not agree with him. You're not supposed to. But by the end of this film, you'll understand why so few are brave enough to say what Schopenhauer said, and why fewer still are brave enough to listen. To understand Schopenhauer's views on women, we must first understand his view of life itself. Arthur Schopenhauer wasn't a philosopher who wrote to comfort you. He wrote to confront you. Unlike the romantics who romanticize suffering, or the idealists who thought reason could elevate mankind, Schopenhauer saw life as a brutal, ongoing struggle powered by a blind, irrational force, the will. According to him, everything we do, from building empires to falling in love, isn't driven by conscious thought or morality, but by a primal, relentless urge to survive and reproduce. Not love, not virtue. Just the will, a ceaseless hunger driving all existence. He saw life as a cosmic trap. We're born into suffering, driven by desires we didn't choose, and condemned to chase satisfaction that always slips just out of reach. If you think this sounds bleak, it's because it is. But here's the genius. Schopenhauer didn't stop at personal angst. He built a whole metaphysical system to explain why we suffer, and how our illusions, like romantic love, marriage, success, and beauty, are all cleverly disguised bait used by nature to continue the species. This is where his ideas about women come in. For Schopenhauer, women weren't the enemy. They were the instrument, the unconscious embodiment of nature's deception. In his view, women were biologically wired to manipulate, seduce, and secure reproduction, not out of malice, but because nature had crafted them to do so. Their charms weren't accidental. They were evolution's weapons. Schopenhauer's criticism wasn't moral. It was mechanical. He believed the feminine was nature's will to life personified. That when men fall in love, they are not experiencing a divine connection, but a chemical hallucination orchestrated by their genes. In short, love is a lie, and women are the most skilled performers in nature's theater. He even wrote, chillingly, "Women exist in the main solely for the propagation of the race." Was he bitter? Probably. He had a notoriously troubled personal life and a deep mistrust of intimacy. But to reduce his philosophy to personal resentment is lazy. That's what many of his critics did, and still do. Schopenhauer's views weren't born out of a single heartbreak. They were the consequence of his entire worldview. If life is suffering, and suffering is caused by desire, then those who ignite our desires become the agents of our torment. That's not misogyny, that's metaphysics. And yet, no one wanted to hear it, not because it was merely cruel, but because it sounded too precise, too close to something that couldn't be easily dismissed, and perhaps something that touched on uncomfortable truths society was not ready to admit, then or now. Because what if love isn't sacred? What if attraction is manipulation? What if morality itself is just a clever costume hiding the machinery of reproduction? These are the questions Schopenhauer raised, and the world wasn't prepared to answer. This section of our journey isn't about agreeing with him. It's about facing the depth of his philosophical structure. Most critics cherry-pick his essay on women and treat it like a sexist rant. But when you put it back into the context of his larger system, something disturbing happens. It starts to make sense, and that's what makes it dangerous, because a lie is easy to refute, but a truth we don't like, that's harder to silence. Schopenhauer's essay on women is not polite, it is not diplomatic, and it certainly isn't concerned with preserving anyone's feelings. But beneath its sharp tone lies a structured philosophical dissection of what he believed was one of the greatest illusions in human life: the idealization of women. He begins with a sentence that sets the tone for everything that follows. Women are by nature meant to obey. It's the kind of statement that instantly ignites outrage. But if we take a breath and read carefully, we find that Schopenhauer wasn't simply venting. He was making a philosophical point grounded in biology, psychology, and metaphysics. He claimed that women were fundamentally different, not just physically, but intellectually, morally, and spiritually. In his view, women were closer to the will to life, nature's blind drive to reproduce and survive. They were instinctive, not rational, tactical, not philosophical. Their strength wasn't in logic or creativity, but in seduction, emotional influence, and strategic survival. He writes, "The fundamental fault in the character of women is that they have no sense of justice." Harsh? Yes. But what did he mean? Schopenhauer believed that justice requires objectivity and distance from emotion, qualities he thought men developed through suffering, struggle, and confrontation with the world. Women, on the other hand, he saw as protected from the worst aspects of life, both by nature and society. Because they were the bearers of children, the future of the species, nature endowed them with traits that ensured survival, not truth. To him, this explained their superior social intuition, manipulative capabilities, and moral flexibility. These weren't defects, they were features that helped them secure resources, safety, and social power in a world dominated by physically stronger men. He even went so far as to mock the concept of romantic love. For Schopenhauer, love was not divine. It was a biological trick, a metaphysical trap designed to lure men into sacrificing themselves for the species. He argued that men fall in love with appearances and illusions, while women calculate strategically who can best serve their needs. Love is nothing but the consciousness of the will to life in its most delusive form. He saw women as agents of this delusion, not because they were evil, but because they were naturally selected to be convincing. In a world where truth meant nothing and survival meant everything, he saw them as perfect biological machines for fulfilling nature's hidden purpose. And yet buried in all this cold analysis is a subtle irony. Schopenhauer admired women's power because it was invisible. While men were busy writing history books, fighting wars, and building monuments, women were shaping the world from behind the curtain through beauty, charm, sexuality, and the ability to control men without force. He even wrote, "The nobler and more perfect a thing is, the later and more slowly does it mature." He argued that women, like children, matured quickly and stopped there. Men, on the other hand, matured slowly but deeply. This was not just a gendered insult. It was a metaphor for the human condition. Schopenhauer saw women as the ultimate symbol of life's deceptive surface, beautiful, necessary, but never quite what they appear to be. Was he exaggerating? Almost certainly. Was he generalizing? Absolutely. But was he lying? That's the question that made his essay dangerous. You see, Schopenhauer didn't write this to oppress women. He wrote it to expose nature, to reveal how what we call love, morality, and even justice might just be sophisticated illusions, a game where the rules are written not by us, but by biology. And for this, he was dismissed, not debated, not disproven, dismissed. Why? Because what he said couldn't be refuted on moral grounds. It had to be ignored. We like to think we're modern, that we've evolved beyond primitive gender roles and ancient instincts. But if that were really true, Schopenhauer's essay would feel outdated and irrelevant. It doesn't. In fact, the very reason this essay remains controversial, more than 150 years later, is because it still hits a nerve. Not because it's barbaric, but because it touches on a possible truth, that love and virtue might just be elegant disguises for the will to power and the will to reproduce. He didn't ask us to agree. He dared us to look closer. Schopenhauer died in 1860, yet strangely, many of his most controversial ideas, dismissed in his own time as cynical or hateful, now echo throughout modern psychology. Not because today's psychologists quote him. Most don't. But because research in behavioral science, evolutionary psychology, and attachment theory has, in some strange way, caught up with him. Let's start with something simple: mate selection. Modern evolutionary psychology tells us that much of human attraction is driven by subconscious cues: health, fertility, status, and the ability to provide or nurture. Men often prioritize youth and physical appearance. Women often prioritize resources, confidence, and social dominance. These aren't opinions. They're findings from decades of cross-cultural studies. And yet, Schopenhauer said the same thing 150 years earlier. Only he said it in sharper, less academic terms. He wrote that women instinctively pursue partners who can ensure their offspring's survival. Today, evolutionary psychologists say the same, but with charts, data, and citations. The packaging has changed. The message hasn't. Even the idea that romantic love is an illusion, a biological trick to ensure reproduction, isn't so radical anymore. Neurological studies now show that love activates the same brain circuits as addiction. The rush of dopamine, the idealization of a partner, the obsessive thoughts, it's all chemically engineered by nature to hook us hard. And when Schopenhauer said that women are masters of manipulation, not out of cruelty but evolutionary necessity, he wasn't far off from what we now describe as female intersexual competition or social strategy. In psychology, these are well-documented behaviors: subtle aggression, status signaling, resource acquisition, emotional regulation. He simply didn't call it strategy. He called it instinct. But let's go deeper. Consider attachment theory, one of the most influential psychological models of the past century. It shows how early childhood experiences shape our emotional patterns, especially in relationships. People develop secure, anxious, or avoidant styles, subconscious programs that govern how they love, trust, and suffer. Schopenhauer didn't have this language, but he instinctively understood the human tendency to chase illusions, to fall for people who mirror our internal chaos, and to suffer under the weight of our unmet emotional needs. His pessimism wasn't rooted in contempt, but in an unflinching observation of human misery, a misery that psychology is only beginning to map out with precision. He even anticipated ideas that now belong to shadow psychology and Jungian analysis. When he described women as closer to nature and instinct and men as representatives of abstract thought and culture, he was sketching the same dualities that Carl Jung would later explore in the form of the anima and animus, the feminine and masculine archetypes in every psyche. The feminine in Jung's system isn't weak. It's mysterious, emotional, powerful in subtle ways. But it is also deceptive, alluring, and hard to define. Sound familiar? What Schopenhauer saw in women was not a fault, but a force that modern psychology still struggles to name without controversy. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The more we learn about human behavior, the more inconveniently right Schopenhauer starts to sound. Not because he was kind, but because he was cold. Because he stripped away the illusions we wrap around love, gender, and morality. Because he dared to say that maybe, just maybe, our highest ideals are built on top of very low instincts, and that if we're not careful, our dreams of equality and romance can turn into sophisticated forms of self-deception. Even the growing popularity of red pill culture, relationship game theory, and dating psychology influencers speaks to a world that is, consciously or not, grappling with the same questions Schopenhauer raised. Why do people choose who they choose? Why do so many relationships implode under the weight of expectations? Why does love so often become a battlefield of power and resentment? He didn't give comforting answers, but he did give a chilling lens, one that perhaps we're only now ready to look through, because people debated his arguments, but because they were offended by them. He wasn't just ignored, he was erased from polite discourse, labeled a bitter, loveless misogynist, a man whose loneliness distorted his worldview. But is that the whole truth? Or was it something else, something far more uncomfortable? Perhaps people didn't ignore him because he was wrong. They ignored him because he was too right, because what he said didn't fit the narrative of a romantic, moral, and enlightened society. His view of human nature as fundamentally irrational, self-interested, and biologically driven clashed with the 19th century ideals of progress, reason, and universal harmony. And it clashes with our modern myths, too. We want to believe in equality, in love without power games, and relationships based on mutual growth. These ideals aren't bad. They're beautiful. But Schopenhauer's work whispered that maybe, just maybe, those ideals are masks over something older, darker, and more primal. And who wants to hear that? Who wants to be told that their love might be a survival instinct? That their partner's affection may be rooted more in biology than destiny? That morality itself might be a social tool, not a universal truth? That's not empowering. That's terrifying. And so the world responded the way it often does when faced with inconvenient truths. It mocked him. It labeled him bitter. It filed him away as irrelevant. But silence isn't the same as refutation. No, mainstream debate ever dismantled his claims point by point. Because to do so, one would have to challenge the foundations of evolutionary biology, social psychology, and the human condition itself. So instead, the world took the easy route. It canceled him before cancel culture existed. And yet, look around. In today's digital age, Schopenhauer's ghost is everywhere, in viral debates about modern dating, in men's forums dissecting hypergamy, female nature, and emotional manipulation, in women's movements fighting against objectification, gaslighting, and control, in therapy rooms where couples struggle to untangle years of unmet expectations, hidden resentment, and psychological warfare. What Schopenhauer called the battle of the sexes has only grown louder. So why does no one bring up his name? Because admitting that he was onto something means admitting that our most sacred ideals, love, fairness, trust, might be built on unstable ground. It's easier to label him hateful than to confront the idea that biology doesn't care about fairness, that nature isn't romantic, that relationships, at their core, are often negotiations of power cloaked in the language of intimacy. This doesn't mean Schopenhauer was always right. He was bitter. He did generalize. He did view the world through a dark lens. But perhaps that's what makes him important, not because he offered hope, but because he offered clarity. In a world drowning in feel-good lies, his brutal honesty hits like a slap in the face, and that's why it still matters. Because what he said wasn't meant to comfort you. It was meant to wake you up. In the age of dating apps, ghosting, influencer, culture, and digital intimacy, men are more confused than ever. What do women actually want? Why do relationships feel more like psychological warfare than partnerships? Why does love, which was once seen as sacred, now feel like a gamble, rigged, and unpredictable? These are not new questions, but modern men are asking them with a sense of urgency, fueled by heartbreak, betrayal, and a growing sense that the rules of the game keep changing. And that's where Schopenhauer comes in, not as a prophet, but as a mirror, because what he said centuries ago isn't about women alone. It's about men waking up. Schopenhauer didn't ask men to hate women. He asked them to see clearly, to understand that beneath every romantic gesture, every longing, every sacrifice lies a biological program, the will to life, that doesn't care about their poetry, their loyalty, or their dreams of happily ever after. That sting you feel when you're ignored, when you're used, when you're left for someone else. Schopenhauer would say, you weren't loved. You were useful, and when you stopped being useful, nature moved on. It sounds cruel, but to many modern men it feels familiar, because in a culture where vulnerability is mocked, where expectations are sky high, and where masculinity is constantly scrutinized, men are beginning to suspect what Schopenhauer shouted, that they're often seen as means to an end, not as ends in themselves, that they are loved conditionally, based on what they can provide, not who they are. And this realization is breaking something deep inside. But here's the twist. Schopenhauer doesn't leave men in despair. His philosophy, if understood properly, becomes liberation. Because when you strip away the illusions of romantic idealism, when you see love as a transaction governed by biology, when you accept that suffering comes from desire itself, you're no longer a puppet of false hopes. You wake up. You stop chasing validation. You stop idealizing what's meant to be instinct. You stop sacrificing yourself on the altar of a fantasy that never really existed, and instead you start reclaiming your time, your energy, your will. You stop asking, why doesn't she love me? And start asking, why did I make her love the condition for my self-worth? In this way, Schopenhauer isn't teaching resentment. He's offering detachment, not hatred, freedom. And maybe that's the lesson modern men need the most. Not to give up on women, but to give up on illusions. Canceling Schopenhauer was easy. He didn't have a platform, no social media, no viral clips, no tribe to defend him. They silenced him the old-fashioned way, with mockery, neglect, and dismissal. And yet, here we are in an age obsessed with psychological truth, emotional intelligence, and gender dynamics. Schopenhauer's most controversial ideas keep echoing back into the discourse. Not because we want them to, but because reality keeps proving them inconveniently true. You can cancel a man. You can ban a book. You can silence a philosopher. But you can't cancel truth. Because truth, real truth, doesn't ask for your approval. It doesn't care about how it makes you feel. It simply waits until you're ready to see it. And that's what Schopenhauer gave us. A mirror, not just for women, but for men, for society, for the lies we tell ourselves about love, virtue, and human behavior. He forced us to stare into the abyss of our biological drives, our hidden motives, our self-deceptions. And what did we do? We looked away. Because facing it means admitting that we're not as moral, not as conscious, not as enlightened as we pretend to be. It means questioning the fairy tales we base our lives on. It means rethinking everything. Why we love, why we suffer, why we're drawn to people who hurt us, and why the truth often feels like betrayal. But here's the twist. What if embracing the dark truth sets you free? What if the moment you stop expecting love to save you, is the moment you save yourself. That's what Schopenhauer tried to offer. Not a handbook for hatred, but a brutal awakening. A path not of despair, but of liberation, through clarity. You don't have to agree with everything he said. You don't have to adopt his pessimism. But you do have to admit, he saw something few dared to speak, something we're still afraid to admit, something that can't be canceled because it's written into our behavior, our history, our DNA, the uncomfortable truth about love, desire, and the human condition. Schopenhauer's words didn't fall on deaf ears because they were wrong. They fell on deaf ears because they were dangerous. Dangerous not because they hurt others, but because they strip away illusions we desperately cling to, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's why Schopenhauer still matters. Not because he was kind. Not because he gave hope, but because he dared to look where no one else would. And told the truth anyway.